All right, welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking all about freshly ground coffee.
Sounds delicious.
It does, doesn't it?
Mhm.
It seems like, our listener here really wants to know the best way to grind coffee, wants that most flavorful cup.
Yeah, yeah, who doesn't?
And they've actually provided a bunch of articles on the topic, so I've been looking through them. And there's a lot of interesting things that are popping up.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there's like a whole debate about when to grind your beans, and like everyone seems to agree grinding right before you brew is
All
best.
right.
Yeah. But not everyone has time to do that every morning.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It's that balance of like the ideal versus like real life, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like some of these articles are suggesting grinding the night before is like a decent compromise.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
So I guess like let's start there. Why is freshly ground coffee so superior? Like what's the science behind it?
Well, you can kind of think of coffee beans as like these tiny little flavor vaults. And so when you grind them, you're like unlocking those flavors, but you're also exposing them to the air,
Oh,
which
okay.
starts to like degrade them. So the longer the grounds just sit there, the more those volatile compounds, the things responsible for the aroma and the taste,
Yeah.
they start to, disappear.
Ah, so it's kind of like opening a bottle of wine. Like the moment that it's exposed to air, it starts to change.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. So grinding right before you brew minimizes that exposure time.
So you get the most like vibrant cup,
The
right?
most vibrant cup, exactly.
So grinding the night before isn't like terrible, I guess.
No, it's definitely not terrible, especially compared to pre-ground coffee.
Right.
But yeah, you do lose a little bit of that peak
Huh.
freshness.
So if we're aiming for like the freshest grind, what's the best way to go about it? I saw the articles mentioning burr grinders versus blade grinders.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
What's the difference?
So for like a consistent grind size, a burr grinder is like the key. It's like the MVP of coffee grinders. Because it uses two revolving abrasive surfaces to crush the beans. And it crushes them uniformly. It's almost like a mini millstone, if you can imagine that.
Okay, yeah.
And this consistency is like super important for even extraction.
Which is how we get all these delicious flavors.
Exactly, from the grounds into your cup.
Yeah. Okay.
And a blade grinder, on the other hand, it's kind of just like chopping the beans up haphazardly.
Really?
So you end up with this uneven mix of different particle sizes,
Oh, okay.
which can lead to, some parts getting over-extracted, some parts getting under-extracted.
So it's like a muddled flavor.
Yeah, exactly. You get this muddled flavor profile. It's not as clean. You know what I mean?
Okay, so it's kind of like a burr grinder. Make sure that all of those like flavor compounds
Yeah,
are released evenly.
exactly. Yeah.
So you get a smoother, more balanced cup.
More balanced for sure.
So it sounds like it's kind of a worthwhile investment if you're serious about your coffee.
It absolutely is. It's like one of the biggest upgrades you can make to your whole setup. Like, I would say it's even more important than like your coffee maker.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's how important it is.
All right. Well, let's talk about storing those freshly ground beans. Because even if we grind them perfectly, improper storage can ruin everything. So
Mhm.
what are the best practices for keeping those grounds fresh?
Well, the main thing is like minimizing exposure to air and moisture,
Makes sense.
because those are the things that are really going to like speed up that degradation of those precious flavor compounds.
Yeah?
And the articles you gave, they recommend airtight containers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they even suggest freezing for long-term storage.
Yeah, I saw that. There's one tip that really surprised me.
Oh, yeah.
Storing coffee with granulated sugar.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I've heard about this.
Have you really?
Yeah, it's like a cool DIY trick.
What is it?
Well, so sugar, it acts as like a desiccant, so it absorbs moisture. So the idea is that if you add like a couple of sugar cubes to your coffee container, it can help prevent that moisture buildup.
Okay.
And it should, like, in theory, protect the coffee's flavor a bit more. But I don't know if there's any like super strong scientific evidence to back it up.
So maybe worth experimenting with.
Yeah, maybe, but I think the airtight container is like the most important thing.
Yeah, that's a non-negotiable.
Exactly. Regardless of the sugar, you got to have the airtight container.
All right, so we've covered the importance of grinding right before brewing, using a burr grinder, and we know that proper storage is crucial to preserving that freshness.
Absolutely.
But the articles also touched on other factors that can impact flavor, like the quality of the beans themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. You can grind coffee perfectly, but if you're starting with bad beans, your coffee's going to be bad.
So it's kind of like having, a top-of-the-line oven, but using stale ingredients.
Exactly.
It defeats the purpose. So how can our listener ensure that they're getting the best quality beans? Like,
Yeah.
what should they be looking for?
Well, I would say the most important thing is freshness. Well, I would say the most important thing is freshness. When you're at the store, look for a roast date on the bag.
Okay,
Ideally, it should be, within the past 2 weeks.
so pretty recent.
Yeah, the fresher the better. And those bulk bins where the beans are just sitting there exposed to the air and the light?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would stay away from those.
Makes sense.
It's kind of like you wouldn't buy wilted produce?
Yeah, you want that, like, crisp, fresh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Treat those beans like the little treasures they are.
Okay, so freshness is key.
Hmm.
But beyond just, like, how recently they were roasted,
Hmm.
are there other things that impact the quality of the beans?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The origin of the beans can make a huge difference in the flavor.
Oh, okay.
Different regions have unique characteristics. Some are known for like brightness and acidity,
Yeah,
and others are more like earthy or chocolatey.
it's like wine, I guess.
Exactly. It's a whole world of exploration for your palate.
So how can our listener, like, navigate this world of bean origins? Are there any, like, tips in the articles?
Yeah, one article had a really interesting suggestion. It said, think about regions you enjoy in other contexts.
Oh.
Like, for example, let's say you really love the citrus notes in, like, wines from a specific region.
Yeah.
Maybe look for coffees from that same region.
That's so interesting. I never thought about, like, my coffee preferences connecting to other tastes.
Yeah, it's cool, right? Your palate might already be, like, attuned to those flavors.
So if I like a citrusy wine, I might like a citrusy coffee.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really good tip.
And then finally, I would say don't underestimate the value of a good coffee roaster.
Yeah.
Those people are passionate about sourcing quality beans, and they can really help you find, like, your perfect cup.
It's like having a coffee mentor.
Totally. They're the experts?
So fresh beans, exploring origins, finding a trusted roaster.
Those are the big ones.
Okay, so we've got our amazing beans now. But even with the best beans, we still have to brew them properly. And the articles mention that the time between grinding and brewing is another crucial factor. What's the science behind that?
Well, remember those volatile compounds we talked about?
Yeah, the ones that give us all the flavor.
Exactly. They're at their peak right after you grind the beans. But as time goes by, they start to, dissipate.
Okay.
And the coffee's flavor just kind of dulls. So that's why brewing immediately, like within 15 minutes, is really the best.
So that, like, big batch of pre-ground coffee for the week is a no-go.
Not ideal, no. You're losing too much flavor. But, I get it. We all have busy lives.
Yeah.
So are there any workarounds if someone needs to grind in advance?
Yeah, because, like, I know a lot of people are trying to, like, streamline their mornings. What would you suggest?
Well, if you have to grind ahead of time, I would say limit it to like a day or two at most.
Okay.
And then, same rules apply. Airtight container, store it in a cool, dark place. And avoid the fridge. A lot of people think the fridge is good for coffee, but it's actually not.
Why not?
Well, the temperature and humidity fluctuations can really mess with the flavor.
Oh, okay.
So just treat those grounds like the little flavor bombs they are. Keep them safe and sound.
Okay, so store them properly. What about grind size? Does that change at all if we're grinding in advance?
It can actually. If you're grinding ahead of time, I would recommend going with a slightly coarser grind
Oh, okay.
that can actually help slow down the oxidation process.
So it preserves the flavor for longer.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So now, let's say we have our freshly ground coffee. We're ready to brew. Are there any sort of, like, universal brewing principles to keep in mind to make sure we're extracting all that goodness?
Absolutely. First and foremost, water quality matters. Good coffee is mostly good water. That's like the secret.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I would say filtered or spring water is ideal.
Okay.
And avoid distilled water. It doesn't have the minerals that actually contribute to the flavor.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like we use good ingredients for cooking, so why not for coffee?
Exactly. You want to treat it with the same respect. And another key factor is the water temperature.
Okay. How hot should it be?
Well, the sweet spot is between 195 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
If it's too hot, you'll end up with a bitter cup.
Okay.
And if it's too cool, it'll be weak and sour.
So we got to find that balance.
Exactly, that Goldilocks zone.
All right. So good water, the right temperature, and our perfectly ground coffee. What else should we be mindful of during brewing?
Well, brewing time is super important,
Okay.
and that can vary a bit depending on your brewing method.
Yeah.
But generally, I would say aim for 4 to 6 minutes.
Okay.
That gives the water enough time to extract all those delicious compounds.
Without getting too bitter.
Exactly. You don't want to overdo it with those bitter
So
compounds.
it sounds like there's a little bit of experimentation involved here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You might need to adjust the grind size, the water temperature, the brewing time, to really dial in what you like best.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
This has been so insightful. We've covered so much ground, from the science of freshness to the art of brewing. It's amazing how many factors go into a truly great cup of coffee.
It really is an intricate process.
But I feel like understanding these elements, it really empowers you to make good coffee at home.
It totally does. It takes you from just, pushing a button on a machine to actually understanding what's going on.
Yeah. So before we move on to part 3, where we'll dive into some listener questions and maybe some more advanced techniques, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
Okay, sounds good.
We talked about why fresh grinding is so essential, how to choose quality beans, the importance of a burr grinder,
Right.
proper storage methods, and then some key brewing principles.
Yep, all the basics.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. And just remember, it's all about enjoying the process. Take the time to savor the aroma, the anticipation, and that first sip. Coffee is an experience.
It's not just a drink, it's a ritual.
Okay, so let's get into some of these listener questions. It seems like a lot of people are curious about cold brew. Do all the same, grinding principles apply, or are there any special things we need to keep in mind for cold brew?
Yeah, cold brew is definitely its own thing, but a lot of those core principles we talked about, they still hold true. Freshness is still key, and you definitely, want to stick with that burr grinder.
Okay, so burr grinder's still the MVP.
Absolutely. But, cold brew, it involves a much longer steeping time,
Yeah,
right?
like way longer, right?
Yeah, usually like 12 to 24 hours. So we have to adjust our grind size accordingly.
Okay, so thinking back to what we were talking about earlier with extraction, we would need a coarser grind for cold brew.
Exactly, yeah. If you use a finer grind, it's going to get way over extracted during that long, steep.
Makes sense. Too much surface area.
Right, too much surface area exposed. And you're going to end up with a really bitter brew.
So for cold brew, are we thinking like coarse sand?
Yeah, think coarse sand, definitely not the finer grinds you would use for other methods.
Okay, cool. Another question that's come up a few times. Single dose grinders.
Oh, yeah, those are cool.
A few listeners want to know if they're worth the investment.
I think they're great, especially for people who are really, really into that ultimate freshness and who want to eliminate waste
Yeah.
because they literally just grind enough for 1 cup. So you're always using the absolute freshest coffee possible.
Sounds pretty tempting.
It is, but I mean, they can be a little bit pricey
Oh, okay.
and it can be kind of time consuming to, grind every single cup individually.
So there's trade-offs.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs, right? It's a balance between convenience and, peak freshness.
So if you're thinking about a single dose grinder, you really got to decide what your priorities are.
Exactly. Figure out how much you value that ultimate freshness.
Okay, last question that I saw come up a bunch. Does the type of coffee bean impact the ideal grind size? Like, do different beans need to be ground differently?
Yeah, it can actually. Different beans have different densities and moisture contents.
Oh, okay.
So that affects how they grind and how they extract. As a general rule of thumb, I would say lighter roasts, which tend to be a little more dense, they might need a slightly finer grind
Okay.
compared to darker roasts, which are a little bit more porous. But honestly, the best way to know for sure is to experiment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even with all these tips and guidelines, you still got to, play around a little bit.
Exactly, yeah. It's all about finding what you enjoy most.
That's part of the fun, right?
Totally. That's part of the beauty of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something new to discover, whether it's a new bean, a different origin, or, a whole new brewing technique.
Yeah, it's a constant adventure. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We covered so much in this deep dive, from the science of freshness to the importance of good beans and all the nuances of grind size to, the art of experimentation.
We did a lot.
Yeah. And hopefully, our listener feels equipped now to brew some amazing coffee at home.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah, we want everyone to feel like their own coffee expert.
Exactly. Become a coffee master.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep experimenting, keep learning, and most importantly,